The deputy believed the tired black man in the old Lincoln had wandered somewhere he didn't belong. He ordered him out, pushed him against the hood, and locked steel around his wrists. What he didn't know was that the quiet man beneath his hands commanded every aircraft, every gate, and every armed team for 3 miles behind them. When the barriers rose out of the pavement, the deputy finally understood what he'd done. He hadn't stopped a stranger outside the base. He'd arrested the man who ran it. The sky above the Carolina coast had gone the color of a bruise when Brigadier General Marcus Reed turned his father's Lincoln onto Harbor Road. The car was 25 years old, cream-colored, with a cracked steering wheel and a radio that only worked when the weather was dry. Nobody looked at it and thought General. That was most of why he kept it. It had belonged to Isaiah Reed, a county deputy who'd worn a badge for 32 years in a part of the state where a black man in that uniform was watched with suspicion by the people he arrested and, some nights, by the men standing next to him. Isaiah never made sheriff, never got a medal big enough to hang in the courthouse. But he'd left Marcus a sentence that had outlasted every order Marcus ever received in the Air Force. A uniform doesn't make a man important. It only makes his mistakes more dangerous. Isaiah had been gone 8 years. Marcus still drove the Lincoln whenever he needed to remember who he'd been before the salutes and the briefings and the 9,000 people who now answered to him at Hawthorne Air Force Base. That evening he was coming back from a retirement dinner for the mechanic, who'd kept the car alive since Isaiah's last years. He'd gone alone, no aide, no driver, dark jeans, a blue cotton shirt, the brown jacket his daughter had given him for his 58th birthday. His uniform was hanging in his quarters, no stars on his shoulders, no name over his heart. To anyone passing on that road, he was just a middle-aged black man in an old car. He preferred it that way. He was half a mile from the eastern gate when headlights came up fast behind him. He checked the speedometer, 44 in a 45. He checked his lane, his mirrors, the road ahead. Nothing. The headlights filled the Lincoln's interior, and then red and blue washed across the rear window. Marcus let out a slow breath. He'd been stopped before. Rank doesn't travel with a man when the uniform's hanging somewhere else. He signaled and began to slow. The shoulder along Harbor Road was narrow and unlit, so he kept rolling another 200 yards toward the entrance lane at Hawthorne's eastern gate. Floodlights, cameras on every approach, concrete dividers, 2 airmen inside a glass booth. Brighter was safer, for both of them. He crossed the thick blue line painted across the asphalt, the one that marked the beginning of federal ground, and stopped short of the first inspection point. Behind him, the patrol car angled in. The door opened before the dust settled. Deputy Caleb Mercer came into the flashing light with one hand near his holster and the other holding a flashlight he didn't need. He'd been out on the commercial roads all evening, and he hated the assignment. Everybody on this stretch was military, current registrations, clean vehicles, and enough procedure in their heads to fight a lazy citation in court. He wanted something better than a taillight. Then the Lincoln came past him, out of county plate, 25 years old, black man at the wheel. The car wasn't speeding, it wasn't drifting, but Caleb decided the driver looked nervous. The only nervous man on Harbor Road that night was the deputy, who badly wanted a reason to feel large. Marcus lowered the window and put both hands on top of the wheel where they could be seen. "Good evening, deputy." The flashlight came straight into his face. "License and registration." "May I ask why I was stopped?" "I'll explain after I see your documents." "My wallet's in my left jacket pocket. Registration's in the glove box. I'm reaching for the wallet first." Caleb's mouth tightened. "Stop narrating and get it." Marcus handed out his driver's license and his military ID. The small red light on the camera clipped to Caleb's chest, blinked steadily in the dark. "Marcus Reed," Caleb read. "You live on base?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "That card explains it." Caleb glanced at the military ID, without ever looking at the rank printed under the photograph. The idea that the man in the old Lincoln in a jacket and jeans might be a senior commander never got as far as his mind. He passed it back through the window. "I asked what you do." "I'm the commanding officer of Hawthorne Air Force Base." 1 second of silence. Then Caleb laughed. Not a real laugh, the sound a young man makes when he's protecting his pride from information he doesn't want. "You expect me to believe you run this base?" "I expect you to verify my identification." Caleb leaned in close. "You blew past a safe stopping point and crossed onto restricted federal property. That's evasion." The shoulder was narrow. "I stopped at the first lit area." You touched the center line back there. I didn't. You calling me a liar? Marcus studied his face. There was anger in it, but underneath was something more dangerous. Embarrassment. A reasonable officer would have looked at the ID again, would have called dispatch, would have walked 100 yards to the gate and asked. Caleb did none of it. The decision had already been made somewhere behind his eyes. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus didn't move. Deputy Mercer, he said, reading the name stitched above the pocket. We're standing on federal property. Base security is 100 yards ahead. Call them. Let them tell you who I am. I gave you an order. I heard it. Then get out. Marcus looked through the windshield at the security booth. He couldn't tell yet whether the airman inside recognized him. He considered staying where he was. Then he thought about how fast a roadside argument turns into a funeral when fear and pride and authority all crowd into the same small space. He'd spent years teaching young officers never to confuse dignity with defiance. Now, he had to live inside his own lesson. I'm opening the door, he said. I'm not armed. He rose slowly out of the car, 6'2", gray at the temples, 40 years of discipline in the way he stood, jeans or no jeans. Caleb noticed it. For half a second, something uncertain crossed his face. Then pride closed over it like a lid. Turn around, hands behind your head. Marcus complied. Caleb seized his right wrist and yanked it down. You don't need force. I'm not resisting. Stop resisting. He shoved Marcus forward. The hood was still warm from the engine, and Marcus's belt buckle scraped a shallow line across the cream paint his father had waxed every Sunday morning for 19 years. You're being recorded by federal cameras, Marcus said. Good. They can watch you go to jail. The cuffs closed too tight. And for the first time that evening, anger came up in Marcus. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that loses control. Something colder. The anger of a man who understands exactly what is happening to him and understands how many other people have had it happen with no cameras, no rank, and nobody watching at all. Caleb went through his pockets. Keys, phone, a folded handkerchief, and a small wooden star, hand-carved, worn smooth at the points. What's this? It was my father's. He a security guard? He was a Cedar County deputy. Caleb turned the carving over once and dropped it on the hood. Everybody's got a story. Marcus turned his head slightly. And every badge has a responsibility. Caleb's grip tightened on his arm. You're under arrest. Failure to stop. Disobeying a lawful command, interfering with an investigation. You haven't conducted an investigation. I'm conducting one now. You're also outside your jurisdiction. I decide where my jurisdiction ends. Marcus went completely still. There are sentences a man says that tell you more about him than an hour of explanation. Caleb had just said one. Inside the gate booth, Airman First Class Jordan Price had stopped breathing. Jordan was 22, 8 months into his first assignment. Raised in a small Alabama town by a mother who worked 2 jobs and a grandfather who still wore his Vietnam cap to church. He'd met General Reed 3 times. At orientation, when the general shook every new airman's hand instead of talking down at them from a stage. Outside the medical center, when he'd crouched to help an old woman gather up a dropped bag of prescriptions. And 2 weeks ago, when he'd pinned a commendation on Jordan's chest for staying calm during a fuel leak. Jordan remembered his eyes. The way he stood, the brown jacket. That same man was bent over the hood of a Lincoln, with a county deputy locking cuffs on him. Jordan lifted the binoculars. His stomach dropped through the floor. Sergeant, his voice came out thin. That's General Reed. The staff sergeant behind him looked up from the entry log. Say again? The driver. The deputies got General Reed in handcuffs. She took the binoculars, looked for 2 seconds, and set them down hard. Command priority, not the routine channel. Go. Jordan's thumb shook on the transmit key. Eastern gate to command security. Emergency at Boundary Blue. Cedar County deputy has detained Base Commander Reed on federal property. Repeat. Base commander is restrained by local law enforcement at Boundary Blue. Static. Then, confirm identity. Visual confirmation, 2 gate personnel. General Reed, civilian clothes, cream Lincoln. Deputy is walking him toward the patrol car. The sergeant had the barrier panel open. Her hand hovered. Do we lock the road? Jordan asked. She watched Caleb pull Marcus away from the car. We protect the installation, she said, and we protect our people. She pressed it. An alarm sounded under the pavement. The road began to vibrate. 20 yards ahead of the patrol car, a reinforced steel barrier came up out of the asphalt. A second one rose behind it, sealing the lane. Heavy gates rolled across the side exits. Floodlights swung and pinned the Lincoln, the deputy, and the handcuffed general in hard white light. Caleb let go of Marcus's arm and stepped back. "What's happening?" Marcus straightened as far as the cuffs allowed. "The base is securing its perimeter." Caleb grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, back up at Hawthorne East Gate. Base personnel are interfering with an arrest." The rest of it drowned under the alarm. Then came engines from inside the wire. 2 security vehicles, then a dark command truck. Personnel stepped out and formed a line behind the barrier, weapons down. Major Andrea Ruiz walked to the front of them and lifted a speaker. 14 years earlier, she'd deployed under Marcus Reed. She had watched him talk terrified lieutenants through rocket warnings. She had watched him sit in the dirt with a wounded pilot until the helicopter came. She had never seen him in handcuffs, and her face showed it. "Deputy Mercer, step away from General Reed and keep your hands where I can see them. This man is under arrest. You're standing on a United States Air Force installation. Release him. I was in pursuit before he crossed the line. The recordings will settle that. Until they do, you're not removing anyone from this installation. You don't control a county investigation. I control security on this base. Your vehicle is boxed. There are 11 cameras on you right now. The safest thing you will do tonight is unlock those cuffs." Caleb looked behind him at the second barrier, then at the first. He was standing in a corridor of light between 2 authorities, and the man he'd called a liar was standing quietly in the middle of it. "Major Ruiz?" Marcus said. Her attention snapped to him. "Sir." "Weapons stay lowered." "They are, sir." "Keep them there. Nobody is turning my humiliation into a funeral." The sentence carried down the whole security line. Every person there heard it. Caleb heard it too, and something in his face changed. "Deputy Mercer is frightened," Marcus went on, "whether he knows it or not. Frightened men make decisions that can't be taken back. Give him room to choose well." "Yes, sir." Caleb stared at the handcuffed man in the jacket and jeans, and only then did he actually hear how the major had answered him. "Yes, sir." Not cautiously. Not to be safe. In recognition. His eyes moved down the line of airmen standing at attention, to the command truck, and back to Marcus. "You really are the commander. That was true before you believed it." Caleb swallowed. His hands weren't steady anymore. "I was conducting a traffic stop. You were asked to verify identification. You didn't stop right away. The cameras will show what I did. You touched the center line. The cameras will show that too." Caleb's hand went toward his cuff key and stopped. "If I let you out now, it looks like I did something wrong." Marcus turned his head far enough to meet the younger man's eyes. "Nothing you do next will erase what you've already done, but it may show whether you're capable of facing it." Caleb looked away. More red and blue arrived beyond the rear barrier. 3 Cedar County vehicles. Sheriff Thomas Mercer climbed out of the lead SUV. Thomas was 59, silver-haired, built like a man who'd once been strong and had never learned how to become gentle. He saw his son sealed inside the boundary. He saw the security line. He saw Marcus Reed standing in cuffs in a wash of white light. For several seconds, he said nothing at all. Marcus knew him on sight. They'd known each other as boys. Their fathers had served together in the Cedar County Sheriff's Office. Back when the county was still divided by customs, no law had finished erasing. Thomas's father had been a respected detective. Isaiah Reed had been one of the department's first black patrol deputies. They'd argued constantly and trusted each other completely. When the detective died of a heart attack, Isaiah had helped the widow keep her house, fixed the porch, carried groceries, drove 12-year-old Thomas to baseball practice for the better part of a year. Thomas knew exactly who Marcus was. He also knew, from 30 feet away, what that wooden star lying on the Lincoln's hood meant. "Open the barrier," he called. "The installation is temporarily secured," Ruiz answered. "That's my deputy in there. And this is our commanding officer." Thomas looked at his son. "Caleb, unlock the general." "Dad, now." Caleb stepped in and opened the cuffs. The steel clicked. Marcus brought his hands around in front of him. Red rings circled both wrists. Ruiz took a step toward him, and he raised a palm. "I'm all right." He picked his father's wooden star off the hood and put it inside his jacket. Thomas watched him do it, and something old and uncomfortable moved through his face. "I want to talk to you," the sheriff said. Marcus didn't answer him yet. "Major Ruiz, preserve every camera recording from the last 30 minutes. Secure Deputy Mercer's body camera and vehicle recorder under the joint evidence agreement." Caleb's hand went to his chest. "This camera belongs to the county. It belongs to the truth." The sheriff's jaw set. "Marcus, let's not make this bigger than it has to be." The first name changed the air. Ruiz glanced at Marcus and waited. Marcus walked to the barrier and stopped a few feet short of it. "It got bigger than both of us the moment your deputy ignored a federal ID, crossed a marked boundary, and put an innocent man in handcuffs. My son made a mistake. A mistake is the wrong date on a report. He's young. He's 29. He believed he had probable cause. He believed his authority excused him from looking for the truth." Thomas glanced up at the cameras mounted over the entrance. "We can review all this privately. We'll review it lawfully. You know what a story like this does to a county? I know what quiet already did to it." Thomas turned toward his son, who was standing beside the patrol car staring at the pavement. "Give him to me. I'll suspend him before sunrise." Marcus took his time answering. He looked at the man who had once eaten dinner at Isaiah Reed's table. "You remember my father?" "Of course I do." "Then remember what he taught both of us. A badge makes mistakes more dangerous." "This isn't the place for an old family lecture." "No," Marcus said. "This is the place where the lesson became evidence." Behind him, a federal investigator had begun photographing the boundary, the vehicles, and the marks on his wrists. Ruiz came close and lowered her voice. "Sir, Deputy Mercer is technically detained inside our perimeter. I need instruction." Marcus looked at Caleb. Without the swagger he'd worn walking up to the Lincoln, he looked very young. "Youth doesn't cancel responsibility." "Interview room," Marcus said. "No restraints unless he refuses instructions. Treat him professionally." Caleb's head came up. "You're arresting me?" "I'm securing this installation while federal authorities determine whether an unlawful detention occurred." "You can't hold a county deputy," Thomas said. "He held a base commander without checking his identification. He can survive an interview." They walked Caleb away from the car. He looked back once at his father. Thomas didn't call out to him. And in the confusion of headlights and radios and rising alarms, nobody but Jordan Price, still holding the binoculars, still watching everything, noticed the small red light on Caleb Mercer's chest camera blink twice and go dark. The eastern gate stayed locked for 17 minutes. Traffic diverted to two other entrances. Military police documented every position. Medical staff photographed the bruise blooming on Marcus's shoulder and the raw skin on his wrists. At his own direction, no public announcement went out. He didn't want rumor outrunning evidence. A little after midnight, he sat in a conference room in the command building. He'd changed into service dress. The dark blue jacket fit him perfectly. Silver stars sat on his shoulders. Ribbons ran across his chest from rescue operations, overseas commands, hurricane relief in 3 states. Andrea Ruiz sat across from him with the base's senior legal officer. On the wall monitor, 4 camera angles played in sync. The first showed the Lincoln approaching at 44 miles an hour. The second showed it centered in its lane the entire time. The third showed the turn signal, "Come on," before the car crossed onto federal ground. The fourth showed Caleb Mercer getting out of his patrol car, well after both vehicles had passed the blue line. Directional microphones had caught most of the words. They watched it twice. "There was no violation," the legal officer said. "No evasion. You signaled and stopped at the first safe place. Deputy Mercer entered federal jurisdiction with no emergency justification." "He ignored the ID," Ruiz added, "applied force after full compliance, and tried to remove the base commander from the installation." On the screen, Caleb shoved Marcus against the Lincoln again. Marcus didn't look away from it. "His body camera," he said. "Is it secured?" Ruiz and the lawyer traded a glance. "The camera was recording when he entered the base," Ruiz said. "The county server lists the file as unavailable." "How long after Sheriff Mercer arrived?" 17 minutes. Marcus sat back. "Convenient. I've contacted the Air Force Office of Special Investigations," the lawyer said. "They'll be here before dawn. Given the civil rights exposure and the interference with federal operations, The Department of Justice may come in behind them. Marcus looked out the window toward the dark runway. I don't want special handling because of my rank. With respect, sir, Ruiz said. This stopped being about your rank the moment the file disappeared. I know. That's why the investigation can't stop at tonight. The lawyer understood immediately. You think there are others. A deputy doesn't get that comfortable ignoring identification, inventing violations, and putting hands on a compliant man in one unlucky evening. He acted like he'd done it before, Ruiz said. Marcus looked down at the marks around his wrists. Find out who else stood where I stood. At 1:30, they brought Sheriff Mercer into the room. He'd taken off his jacket and rolled his sleeves. He looked tired. He did not look humbled. For a moment neither man spoke, and 50 years sat in the silence between them. I'm sorry you were treated that way, Thomas said finally. Are you sorry it happened? Marcus asked. Or sorry it happened to the one man on that road who could lock the gate? That's unfair. Unfair was your son deciding my old car and my skin outweighed my federal ID. Caleb says you were confrontational. Marcus nodded at the lawyer. She pressed a key, and the audio filled the room. Marcus level throughout, Caleb's voice climbing, then the warning about federal cameras and the sound of a body hitting sheet metal. Thomas sat very still. He's been under pressure, he said. From who? He's been trying to prove himself. Then you put a man desperate to prove himself in a job where he can take away another person's freedom. I didn't teach him that. You taught him consequences could be negotiated. Thomas pushed his chair back an inch. You don't know what I taught my son. I know 3 citizen complaints against him died inside internal review. The sheriff's face changed. The lawyer opened a second folder. Those surfaced in a preliminary cross-reference of joint public safety notifications sent to this base after each arrest. One involved a black maintenance sergeant assigned to Hawthorne. One involved a Hispanic flight technician. One involved a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran named Earl Thompson. That proves nothing. No, Marcus said. It gives us a reason to look. You're going to gut my department because my son lost his temper. Your son may have exposed damage that was already there. You could end his career. Caleb made choices that may end his career. Thomas stared at the stars on Marcus's shoulders. You always did think you were better than the rest of us. Marcus didn't get angry. Something sadder came into his face instead. My father spent years telling me your family was worth helping. Don't bring him into this. He brought himself into it the day he pinned on a badge next to your father. Marcus leaned forward. Isaiah believed law enforcement could be honorable because he'd seen honorable men inside it. He also knew what happens when good men protect the wrong person for personal reasons. So I'm a bad man for protecting my son. You're a sheriff, which means the people of Cedar County are also your sons and daughters. Thomas's eyes were wet. His voice stayed hard. What do you want? The truth. And then? Accountability, which means neither of us decides how this ends. Marcus slid a document across the table. At 6 this morning, Deputy Mercer transfers to federal investigators. Every recording, dispatch log, complaint, and disciplinary file connected to him gets preserved. Thomas didn't touch it. And if I refuse? Then the refusal becomes part of a federal obstruction inquiry, the lawyer said. The sheriff stood. You may run this base, Marcus. You don't run Cedar County. Marcus stood too. No, the law does. At 4:15 in the morning, 64-year-old Ruth Ellison sat alone in the Cedar County Emergency Communications Center. 37 years on the boards. Hurricanes, factory fires, highway pileups, and the nights when a child whispered into a phone from a dark bedroom. Ruth had learned that voices tell you what reports leave out. She knew Caleb Mercer's voice. She knew the lift that came into it before a stop. She knew how fast he turned calm drivers into aggressive ones on the radio. And she knew how often his body camera failed on exactly the arrests people complained about. She'd raised it twice. The first concern vanished somewhere inside the sheriff's office. The second earned her a lecture about respecting the chain of command. That night, she'd listened to him call for backup from Hawthorne's eastern gate. She'd also seen the vehicle data. His emergency lights came on before the Lincoln did anything at all. When she checked the server, the body camera file was gone. But Ruth had been working communications before Caleb Mercer was born. She knew the system wrote a temporary backup before it pushed anything to permanent storage. She also knew the sheriff had never once in his life understood the old archive terminal in the equipment room. She went in and shut the door. The recording was still there. She watched the whole stop from the deputy's own chest. She heard Marcus identify himself. She watched Caleb hand the card back without reading it. She watched a compliant man get shoved into a car hood. And then, at the very end, after the barriers were up, after the floodlights came on, she watched Caleb step close to his patrol car, turn his shoulder to the base, and whisper into his radio, "Dad, tell them he was weaving. I need you to back me." And a voice she had listened to for 20 years answered, "Don't say anything else. I'll handle the recording." Ruth played it again, then a third time, with her hand over her mouth. Then she copied the file onto 2 drives. One went into her handbag, the other went into an envelope addressed to the regional office of the Department of Justice. For nearly 4 decades, she had sent help to strangers. That morning, she decided to send the truth. Federal investigators reached Hawthorne just after sunrise. Special Agent Naomi Carter had spent 21 years working public corruption, and she had the unhurried manner of someone who has already thought about where every road ends. She met Marcus in his office at 7:30. Neither of them had slept. She went through the gate footage, the medical photographs, the jurisdiction maps. Then she closed the laptop and asked him to describe the stop without referring to any of it. He did. She interrupted him 6 times, not because she doubted him, but because every one of those details would eventually be tested by defense attorneys, union lawyers, and men with political friends. When he finished, she set down her pen. "General Reed, let's be clear with each other. Your position doesn't make your statement automatically credible. I understand. But your statement matches the recordings." She turned a page. "You've also asked us to look at his previous arrests near this base." "Yes." "That becomes a much larger investigation." "It should, if the facts justify it." Naomi studied him for a moment. "Most people in your position want to know what happens to them." Marcus looked at the photograph on the shelf behind his desk, a young deputy in a county uniform, squinting into 1970s sunlight. "I had cameras, trained security, legal counsel, and a gate that couldn't be crossed," he said. "Most people have none of that." "Your father?" "Cedar County, 32 years. Naomi nodded slowly. "Then you know what an investigation like this does to the honest officers in that department." "I do." "And you still want it?" "I want the honest ones separated from the men using them as cover." At 8:20 she walked into the interview room where Caleb Mercer sat with a county attorney. He'd recovered some of his confidence overnight. He said the Lincoln had drifted across the line. He said it kept going nearly half a mile after his lights came on. He said Marcus had argued, refused commands, and pulled away during the arrest. Naomi let him finish every word. Then she laid 4 photographs on the table. The Lincoln, centered in its lane. The turn signal, lit. Both vehicles stopped on federal ground. And Marcus Reed with his hands already laced behind his head before Caleb ever touched him. "Cameras don't show everything," Caleb said. She set a transcript beside them. "This one shows enough." He glanced at his attorney. "My body camera will prove my side." "We recovered it." The color went out of his face. "That file was damaged." "No, it was deleted from the county server after your father arrived." She let that sit. "We also recovered you asking him to support a false account." I was confused. "You were clear enough to request a specific lie." "My father told me not to say anything." "Your father told you he'd handle the recording." The attorney raised a hand. "We're done here." Naomi gathered her photographs without hurry. "That's your right. Deputy Mercer will remain available while we review federal civil rights violations, unlawful detention on a military installation, false reporting, and evidence tampering." Caleb's voice broke across the room as she reached the door. "I didn't know who he was." She stopped. "That may be the most important thing you've said all morning." He looked up, almost hopeful. "Because the law never required him to be a general," she said, "before you treated him like a human being." By noon, the sheriff had issued a statement calling the incident a jurisdictional misunderstanding. He didn't mention a deleted file. He didn't mention a false traffic claim. He put his son on paid administrative leave and promised a fair internal review. It might have worked if Ruth Ellison had stayed quiet. At 12:43, she walked into the regional federal building with her handbag and the second copy. She sat with both hands around a paper cup of water. "I should have come forward sooner." Naomi didn't offer her any comfort she hadn't earned. "Why didn't you?" I was afraid of losing my pension. Ruth turned the cup a quarter turn, and I kept telling myself I did more good staying, that I could watch him, warn the other dispatchers, keep things from getting worse. Did it work? Sometimes. And the other times? Ruth looked at the table. The other times I heard people calling for help, and I sent them the man they were afraid of. She put the drive on the table. That's the full recording. The sheriff's on it. Anything else? She hesitated. Then she took out a notebook held together with a rubber band. 11 months of it. Dates, locations, missing recordings, altered dispatch codes, complaints that went into the sheriff's office and never came back out. 43 entries. Mrs. Ellison, Naomi said carefully, do you understand what this is going to lead to? Ruth's eyes were exhausted and completely steady. I understand what staying quiet already led to. The investigation widened before the end of the day. Agents pulled 4 years of Caleb Mercer's arrests and laid them against body camera records, dispatch audio, and court filings. Patterns came up out of the paper like a photograph in Developer. He stopped Black and Hispanic drivers on those roads at more than 4 times the rate of any other deputy assigned to them. He repeatedly wrote polite questions down as hostile behavior. In several reports, he described drivers as failing roadside tests that the video showed them passing. Some recordings ended seconds before physical contact. Others were simply gone. And the worst of them belonged to Earl Thompson. Earl was 72, a retired school principal who'd served in Vietnam at 19 and then taught history for 35 years. 10 months before the night on Harbor Road, Caleb had stopped him driving home from a veteran's dinner. Earl had just had knee surgery. When he couldn't hold his balance on one leg at the side of the road, Caleb arrested him for impaired driving. The blood test came back clean. No alcohol, nothing prohibited. Caleb's report described him as confused, unsteady, and confrontational. The prosecutor didn't dismiss it. He reduced it, and Earl took the lesser traffic offense because he couldn't afford to fight it for a year. His insurance went up. His church quietly asked someone else to drive the community van. The county paper printed the arrest and never once printed the blood test. Earl stopped going to veterans' events. When federal agents came up his walk, he assumed they had more questions about that night. Instead, Naomi Carter told him the case was being reopened. He listened without a word. His wife Margaret sat beside him holding his hand. "Will the newspaper print that I was innocent?" he finally asked. "We can't control the newspaper." "That's what I figured. But we can correct the record." "The record lives in a courthouse," Earl said. "Shame lives in people's memories." Naomi closed her folder. "Mr. Thompson, what would justice look like to you?" He looked at the wall, at a photograph of himself at 19, in an army uniform, and another of 4 decades of students on the steps of Jefferson High School. Justice would be my grandchildren knowing I told the truth. 2 days later, Marcus came to see him. He didn't wear the uniform. He drove the Lincoln and sat on the porch under a ceiling fan that ticked once every rotation, and for an hour they talked about Vietnam, about schools, about the strange way a man's oldest memories become the closest ones. Eventually, Earl asked about the stop at the base. "Were you afraid?" Marcus considered it honestly. "Yes." Earl looked surprised. "You run an airbase. Fear doesn't check a man's rank before it gets in the car." Earl nodded at the street. "I was afraid too. For months afterward, every time headlights came up behind me." "I understand." "No, General." Earl said it gently, without any edge at all. "You understand now." Marcus took the correction. "You're right." Earl rubbed his knee. "That deputy looked at me like he'd already decided what kind of man I was. He did the same to me." "But your gate closed." "Yes. Mine never did." The words went into Marcus deeper than any accusation could have. "That's why I'm here," he said. "I can't change what happened to you, but I can make sure your truth gets heard." "Why?" "Because I had protection you didn't." Earl looked out at the cream-colored car in the driveway. "That your father's?" "It was. I remember Deputy Isaiah Reed." Marcus turned. "You knew him?" "He came out to Jefferson High when I was a young principal. We had a boy stealing food out of the cafeteria, and the board wanted him expelled. What did my father do? Found out there was nothing to eat in that boy's house, bought the groceries himself, then made the boy work off every dollar after school." Earl smiled for the first time. He believed justice could be firm without turning cruel. "Yes. You believe that?" Marcus looked at the fading marks on his wrists. I'm trying to. The Department of Justice announced a formal civil rights investigation into the Cedar County Sheriff's Office the following week. Thomas Mercer stood in front of the courthouse cameras and said his department had served the community honorably, and that his son was a dedicated deputy who'd made a difficult call in a fast-moving situation. 90 minutes later, federal officials released 90 seconds of gate footage. Marcus offering his identification. Caleb handing it back unread. A compliant man driven into the hood of his own father's car. The county watched it on their phones in silence. And then all at once. Some defended Caleb. Many were furious. And a lot of people started telling their own stories. A 68-year-old woman whose car he'd searched for 40 minutes over a turn signal. A young airman detained at the roadside while his pregnant wife waited in the passenger seat. A restaurant owner who said the same patrol car parked outside his door every Friday and stopped his customers after dark. Not every complaint was true. Not every hard encounter was misconduct. Marcus insisted on that line, and he insisted on it in a room full of investigators who no longer wanted to hear it. Bias destroyed that deputy's judgment, he said. Don't let anger destroy ours. Naomi Carter agreed. Evidence, not outrage. And that discipline brought them people they never would have gotten otherwise. 3 Cedar County deputies came forward. The first admitted Caleb had asked him to copy false language into a report. The second produced messages showing the sheriff pressuring supervisors to close complaints against his son. The third was Sergeant Paul Hendricks, 55, 26 years under Thomas Mercer. He came into the federal building carrying a cardboard box and looking like a man attending his own funeral. I should have stopped this, he said. Why didn't you? Naomi asked. Thomas and I started the same week. He stood beside me when my wife died. Caleb grew up calling me Uncle Paul. That explains loyalty. It doesn't excuse cowardice. Inside the box were 7 complaints he'd been ordered to close without a full investigation. One of them was Earl Thompson's, with Paul's signature on the last page. Did you believe Mr. Thompson? Yes, but you signed the finding against him. Yes. Why? Paul looked at his hands for a long moment. Because the sheriff told me the department couldn't survive another scandal. He said protecting the office protected all of us. And did it? It protected one person, Paul said, the wrong one. The evidence reached Thomas Mercer in pieces. Ruth's recording, Paul's box, the messages, and finally the digital audit showing that someone using the sheriff's own credentials had ordered his son's body camera file destroyed. He had spent a career believing a crisis could be managed with relationships, favors, and quiet conversations in parking lots. Now, every favor had become a document. Every relationship had become a witness. Every protected mistake had come back wearing an evidence tag. He asked to meet Marcus privately. They walked in the small memorial garden outside the base chapel, where a stone path curves between oak trees and white benches, and the names of service members who died while assigned to Hawthorne. Thomas came without his jacket. Marcus wore his uniform. They walked a long way before either of them spoke. I remember the first day your father put on that deputy's uniform, Thomas said at last. My daddy brought him home to dinner. Half the street stood on their porches to watch. He told me. He laughed about it. He laughed when things hurt. Thomas stopped by the fountain. After my father died, Isaiah taught me to change the oil in our truck, fixed our roof before a hurricane, never asked me for one thing. He shook his head. I always told myself I'd pay him back by looking out for you. I didn't need you to look out for me, Marcus said. You needed to look out for the people your son pulled over. Thomas closed his eyes. I kept thinking he'd mature. Consequences are part of maturing. I protected him because I knew this county would never forgive him for one bad night. You protected him from the first one, Marcus said. That's what bought the second. Thomas turned to face him. Do you hate him? No. The answer unsettled him more than fury would have. How can you not? Hate would make this about what I feel. It's about what he did. He may go to prison. That's the court's decision. Thomas looked older than he had a week before. And me? That depends on what you do next. They want me to admit I ordered that recording deleted. Did you? Thomas looked at the names carved into the stone. Yes. Barely audible. Then tell them. I'll lose everything. Marcus's voice softened, and didn't weaken at all. You lost the part that mattered the night you asked your son's badge to carry a lie. Thomas's eyes filled. My wife died believing Caleb would be sheriff one day. Your wife believed he'd be a good man. Those aren't the same thing. The sheriff wiped his face with the back of his hand. What would Isaiah say to me? Marcus looked up through the oak branches at the pale afternoon sky. He'd tell you the truth hurts less once you stop running from it. Thomas Mercer resigned the next morning. In a written statement, he admitted ordering the destruction of evidence and interfering with prior internal investigations involving his son. He surrendered to federal authorities that afternoon. Caleb was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law, filing false reports, unlawful detention, and conspiracy to destroy evidence. The county prosecutor, who'd quietly reduced several disputed cases, came under investigation of his own. For most of the county, the arrests felt like the end of the story. For Marcus, they were the beginning of the part that mattered. 27 cases connected to Caleb Mercer were reopened. 9 convictions were vacated. 6 drivers received formal apologies and reimbursement of legal costs. 3 cases held up under independent evidence and were allowed to stand. Marcus considered that last number the most important one in the file. Justice cannot become another word for revenge. Earl Thompson's conviction was vacated in a packed courtroom. He wore a charcoal suit and the tie his students had given him when he retired. Margaret sat in the front row beside Marcus. The judge reviewed the clean blood test, the incomplete report, and the recovered footage. Then she looked directly at the old man standing in front of her. Mr. Thompson, this court failed to protect the presumption of your innocence. Your record is cleared as of this moment. Earl rose slowly. Thank you, Your Honor. Outside, the reporters closed around him on the steps. One of them asked whether he felt vindicated. Earl looked into the cameras and took his time. I feel sad, he said, because it took the arrest of a general before anybody would listen to a retired school teacher. The steps went quiet, but I'm grateful, he went on, that the general didn't close the gate behind himself. He held it open for the rest of us. That sentence ran in newspapers in 40 states. Marcus kept a copy of it in his desk drawer. Caleb Mercer's case reached federal court 11 months later. He didn't look like the deputy who'd walked up to the Lincoln with a flashlight and no doubts. Plain dark suit, shoulders turned inward. His face had gone thin. The gallery was full. Former defendants, deputies, airmen, reporters. Marcus sat in the second row. Earl Thompson sat beside him. Caleb had agreed to plead guilty to 2 federal counts. The agreement required him to state that he'd had no lawful basis for the stop, and that race had shaped his suspicion of the man in the car. When the judge asked whether the written statement was true, he hesitated. Then he looked out at the gallery, and his eyes found Marcus. For a year, he'd blamed pressure, training, expectations, his father. In that moment, not one of those things would stand between him and the man he'd put in handcuffs. Yes, he said, it's true. The judge asked if he wanted to speak. He stood. I spent my whole life believing respect came with authority. My father was the sheriff. People moved when he walked into a room. When I got my badge, I thought it meant everybody else had to prove themselves to me. His voice shook. I stopped General Reed because I decided he looked suspicious before he did anything at all. When he told me who he was, I heard it as an insult. I cared more about being obeyed than about being right. He looked at Marcus one more time. I don't expect forgiveness, but I am sorry. Marcus didn't nod. He didn't smile. An apology can be completely sincere and still be smaller than the harm that required it. Caleb received 4 years in federal prison and permanent disqualification from law enforcement. His father received a shorter sentence for cooperating and for admitting his role. Some people in Cedar County thought the sentences were cruel. Others thought they were nothing. Marcus had stopped expecting justice to satisfy everyone. That was never what it was for. In the corridor afterward, Caleb's attorney handed Marcus a sealed envelope. He didn't open it until that evening, alone in his quarters, with his father's wooden star on the table beside him. The handwriting was uneven. Caleb wrote about the first time he'd ever met Isaiah Reed. He'd been 7 years old at a sheriff's office picnic, and a black deputy with big hands had shown him how to carve a boat out of a scrap of pine. He remembered being told to always cut away from himself. A tool doesn't care whose son you are. He wrote that he'd forgotten it. That power doesn't care who handed it to you either. That used carelessly, it damages the man holding it as surely as the man standing in front of it. At the bottom of the page was one question. How does a man become more than the worst thing he's done? Marcus read it 3 times. Then he set the letter beside the wooden star and turned off the lamp. He didn't answer it that night. The reforms came slowly, the way real ones do. An interim sheriff invited federal oversight. Body camera files began transferring automatically to an independent server that no one in the department could reach. Complaint review moved outside the chain of command entirely. Hawthorne opened a joint training program for county officers and base security. Marcus insisted it be more than a law class. Deputies sat in rooms with military families and listened. Airmen listened to deputies describe rolling up on a dark house with almost no information. Retired officers talked about the difference between command presence and personal pride. Ruth Ellison taught documentation and evidence preservation. Paul Hendricks taught one session on institutional loyalty and said the only sentence anyone quoted afterward, "Loyalty isn't helping someone escape what he's done. That's fear wearing a friend's clothes." And Earl Thompson taught the opening class. He stood in front of 80 uniformed men and women, wrote 4 words on the board, and turned around. "Authority reveals character. A badge doesn't create the person wearing it," he said. "It just gives him room to show you who he already was." Some officers resisted all of it, most didn't. A surprising number were simply tired of being judged by men they'd privately distrusted for years, and had never had a safe way to say so. Jordan Price received the Air Force Commendation Medal for his actions at the Eastern Gate. His mother and his grandfather sat in the front row of the hangar, the old man in his Vietnam cap. This airman identified a threat, Marcus told the assembled personnel. But that isn't why he's standing here. His courage was in trusting what he saw, when a man with more authority than him wanted the world to see something else. Afterward, Jordan's grandfather took Marcus's hand in both of his. "Thank you for looking after my grandson, General." "Sir, your grandson looked after me." The old veteran smiled. "That's how it's supposed to work." 1 year after the night of the arrest, Marcus drove the Lincoln down Harbor Road again. The mechanic had done what he could with the hood, but a shallow scar remained where a belt buckle had dragged across the paint. He'd offered to take it out completely. Marcus told him to leave it. "Some marks aren't beautiful, they're just honest." The sun was going down over the marshes, laying gold across the reeds, white birds crossing above the water. He slowed as he came up on the eastern gate. The blue line had been freshly repainted, and beside it stood a new sign that had come out of the joint program: Federal Installation Boundary. All authorities subject to law and recorded procedure. He pulled into the inspection lane. Staff Sergeant Jordan Price stepped out of the booth, no longer the kid who'd fumbled the binoculars, standing easy in his own uniform now. "Evening, General." "Evening, Sergeant. Identification, please." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Jordan smiled. "Procedure, sir." He handed over the card. Jordan checked the photograph properly, front and back, and passed it through the window. "Welcome home, General Reed." Marcus looked past him at the open gate. "Is the perimeter secure?" "Yes, sir." "And the boundary?" Jordan glanced down at the fresh blue paint. "The line's holding, sir." Near the visitor center, an old man in a charcoal suit was waiting with his wife, a folder under his arm, ready to teach another evening class to a room full of county deputies. Earl Thompson raised a hand. Marcus raised his in return. He had learned, that year, that the boundaries that matter are almost never painted on pavement. There's a line between confidence and arrogance, between loyalty and corruption, between enforcing the law and believing yourself larger than it, between making a mistake and building a machine to hide it. Caleb Mercer had crossed those lines long before he ever drove onto the base. His father had watched him do it and moved the markers to cover him. Ruth Ellison had stood beside the line for years until her conscience finally made her step across it. Jordan Price had recognized the exact moment when obedience stopped being enough. And Marcus had learned that leadership isn't proved by closing a gate around yourself. It's proved by holding it open for the people who never had a gate at all. Because justice is not a steel barrier coming up out of the road at the perfect moment. Almost nobody gets one of those. Justice is a dispatcher, preserving a file when deleting it would have been easier. An officer admitting his loyalty had curdled into cowardice. A judge correcting a record after the damage has already moved into a man's house. A commander refusing to protect only the people wearing his own uniform. It's slower than anger, and far less satisfying than revenge. It doesn't give back the lost year, or the church van, or the name in the newspaper. But when enough ordinary people choose the truth over their own comfort, it becomes strong enough to hold a line no machine can defend. A few weeks later, Marcus finally answered the letter. He wrote one page. You asked how a man becomes more than the worst thing he's done. He starts by naming it honestly. Then he accepts what it cost other people. Then he changes, without demanding that any of them forgive him. And he spends whatever life he has left protecting people from the man he once allowed himself to become. My father believed justice could be firm without turning cruel. I still believe that. What happens next is yours. He signed it with his name. Not his rank. Caleb read it alone in the prison library and folded it into the only book he'd checked out that week, A History of American Law Enforcement. For the first time in his life, he was reading it not to prove that authority was necessary, but to understand why it needed limits. That evening at Hawthorne, Marcus walked out to the parking lot alone. The Lincoln sat under an oak tree, cream paint glowing in the last of the light. He ran his hand across the scar on the hood, and for a moment he could feel his father standing at his shoulder. Isaiah wouldn't have cared about the federal investigation, or the news vans, or the sentence handed down in a federal courtroom. He'd have asked one question, the same one he asked about everything. Did you leave it better for the next man? Marcus looked toward the gate. Jordan Price inside the booth, Earl Thompson talking to a knot of young deputies, Ruth Ellison walking the path with Paul Hendricks, arguing about a reporting procedure. The gate was open, the cameras were running, the blue line lay clear and bright across the road. Yes, Dad, he said. Then he got in, and the old engine turned over with its familiar low rumble, and he drove slowly down toward the boundary, carrying no anger he couldn't control, and no authority he'd forgotten how to question. Jordan stepped out and saluted. Marcus returned it. The barrier stayed where it was, down under the pavement, exactly where it belonged. It didn't need to rise. The men and women standing around it had finally learned what it was built to protect. Not the pride of a commander. Not the reputation of a department. Not the future of a powerful family. Only the oldest and most fragile promise there is, that no uniform stands above the truth. Marcus crossed the line and drove on, and night came down soft over the Carolina marshes. A year ago, flashing lights on this road had shown him the worst of one man and the courage of a dozen others. Tonight there was nothing behind him but the steady sound of his father's old Lincoln, carrying him home. And for the first time since the night he'd been pinned against its hood, the darkness past the gate didn't look to him like a place without protection. It looked like the place where protection matters most.